off. We should have a bigger rate space. We shouldn't be facing a situation where the City Council haven't enough money. Why is the Liberty still semi-derelict and with high unemployment? And why are there over 100 derelict sites on the Lewis lines? Why is Mountjoy Square not a jewel in the crown of city centre living, as is the case in Merrion Square? I think it was John mentioned London, or somebody else mentioned London. I was in London last week visiting some of my relations. There are wonderful residential quarters for middle class people in London. And we need to get back to that in Dublin. Because if we don't, we will have no social fabric. And the ghettos will take over. And the city will burn. Why are our young generation of workers and professionals in negative equity housing and banished to 2-hour commutes beyond the M50? I mean, we've had all the plans written down. The words were all there. So why is this the outcome? Why does public transport still not meet current demand for public transport? I've actually recently done some analysis of all of the public transport system and all of the cars in the city centre. And 80% of the revenue is coming from the cars, the car shopper. And 20% is coming from all of the public transport. And yet we have a policy of banning the car as a kind of a simplistic solution. Now, if we want people working, you must have the economy working and you must have civic society working. Adam Smith, who is the great Scottish economist, wrote The Wealth of Nations. And he said, and I'm just going to quote this, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest." And we might add today the builder, the banker, and the government who've mishandled our economy. Capitalism has faltered in the last decade as fraud and the state of the stock market and the American business model of the Republicans, which is unfettered self-interest and privatization, has rocked corporations. It's not just here, it's everywhere. And I believe there's a gap between conventional wisdom and reality. And the conventional wisdom is the kind of cozy talk that everybody does and nobody wants to challenge anything, and we're not thinking sufficiently radically and rationally about what is reality and where you can't decide the future unless you're realistic about the present. I would argue that the naive ramblings of the Dublin Regional Authority over the last few years and their swallowing of the myths of a benign market and competition has helped create the obscene dispersal in the Dublin region and its attendant traffic and commuting costs, side by side with the meaningless mantra of the primacy of the city centre. In the last 10 years, the well-being of the Dublin city centre has been taken for granted. And there's been a gap between words and reality. And we believe that the city centre actually is in decline. It's relative. Is it better now than it used to be? Yes, it is. When I came to Dublin first, you could park your car outside the GPO and you could go in and buy a stamp, post a letter, and go over to Cleary's and buy something and come back and the car would still be there. And you didn't have to pay a charge or anything. I used to park my car out in Dawson Street every day because my office was in the Hibernian Hotel next to it, and you could walk over Molesworth Street through the front door of Leinster House, wave to all the guys there, go through the back door and go around the corner to the National Gallery for a cup of coffee. There was no security. The problem was that 2 people out of every 3 who were born in this country were forced to emigrate. At that time, there were no jobs. And we now have a situation where we have doubled the number of people at work in Ireland than we've had compared to 10 years ago. So we have made a huge amount of progress. But we need to change the way we're thinking to make the next step to get to a real viable future. We can't continue with the policies of the present. Now, I think I've mentioned the Dublin region. So what are the future challenges we have? I mentioned earlier that we are not going back to the past once the recession is over. We'll be in a completely new world. And they're called BRICS, and they're in John's document as well. I call them BRICS, B-R-I-C-S. B is for Brazil, R is for Russia, I is for India, and C is for China. And they're the new challenges of the economy for Europe and for America. And we will have to operate to a much higher standard, and that means we must get our cities working, we must get our population working. The single biggest issue we have, in my view, is education. We must put more money into education in order to make sure we have informed citizens. You cannot have a democracy without an informed citizenship. And people debating and arguing and doing what we're doing here on a wider basis. Now, the Lord Mayor did raise the question about the city and the lack of engagement by the middle class. But the middle class are not living in city centre, the same as they live in Paris or in Manhattan or in Philadelphia, and we do need to get a middle class population living in the city centre. It's not enough to have them working in the city centre. If we educate people to a really new high standard, then obviously we need to have more innovation. We need to do things ourselves. We have 600 or thereabouts American companies, and they're the majority of our exports. And at the moment I hear a lot of talk about the Irish indigenous sector are employing most of the people, which is true, but I have to say that their performance hasn't been great. When we have a European consumer base of 600 million and they seem to be totally focused on the UK and the value of sterling, there's something seriously wrong. They need to be out there. They need to employ people with languages. They need to employ designers instead of just picking up brochures from somewhere else and photostating it. And we need to attract talent, because without the talent we won't have enough here to be able to grow the talent. We haven't enough of a population. I happen to hold the view that I think that the Irish could become extinct. Not in my lifetime, not in anybody's lifetime here, but the population of the world is growing, as Brian said, and as more and more people come in here, we will change. But hopefully at that stage they'll all be Irish, regardless of their colour or their religion. And so the question I think I want to pose is, do we really believe that a great city, Dublin City, and a great Dublin region can be delivered if our position in the traditional secular rational axis remains closer to the countries of Latin America and South Asia? And if we do, how radical do we need to be to achieve it? Thank you very much.